two pink lines, one impossible choice, a future neither of them planned. Victoria Hale, CEO, empire builder, woman who controlled everything, stood frozen in her penthouse bathroom, staring at a pregnancy test that would destroy the only relationship she'd ever fought for. Miles away, Daniel Brooks flipped pancakes for his daughter, a single father who'd survived abandonment once and swore never again. But Victoria carried his child. Tonight, she would tell him, and everything would shatter. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit like and comment your city so I can see how far this journey travels. The test sat on the marble counter like a loaded gun. Victoria Hale pressed her palms against the cool stone, her reflection staring back from the floor-to-ceiling mirror. A woman who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without flinching, who had fired executives with surgical precision, who had built an empire from nothing but ambition and sleepless nights. But right now, looking at those two pink lines, she felt like a stranger in her own skin. Pregnant. The word didn't fit. It belonged to a different version of her life, one with minivans and suburban houses and women who baked cookies for school fundraisers. Not her, not Victoria Hale, whose face graced the covers of business magazines, whose name made board members straighten their spines. She had always known exactly what she wanted: precision, control. Success measured in quarterly reports and stock prices. Romance had been an afterthought, something she scheduled between conference calls, something that never quite stuck. Until Daniel, who had walked into her carefully ordered world 6 months ago and made her forget why she'd built those walls in the first place. She closed her eyes, remembering. It had started at Sophie's school fundraiser. Victoria had only attended because her PR team insisted: community engagement, visibility, humanize the brand. She'd shown up in a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, prepared to smile for exactly 90 minutes before retreating to her penthouse. Then she'd met him, Daniel Brooks, standing by the bake sale table with flour still dusted on his jeans, looking completely out of place among the perfectly coiffed suburban mothers. He'd been helping his daughter arrange cupcakes, patient and unhurried, and when he smiled at the little girl, Sophie, she'd later learn, something in Victoria's chest had twisted unexpectedly. "You're the CEO," he'd said when they were introduced, no trace of the usual reverence or intimidation. "The one who bought out Meridian last year." "Guilty," she'd replied, surprised he knew. That was ruthless. He'd handed Sophie a cupcake, wiping frosting from her cheek. "Also brilliant. My business economics professor used it as a case study." "You study business?" "Studied. Past tense." His smile had been self-deprecating. That was before life got complicated. Sophie had tugged his sleeve, pointing at something across the gymnasium, and he'd excused himself with an apologetic shrug. But Victoria had watched him go, intrigued by a man who seemed utterly unimpressed by her title and completely devoted to the small hand wrapped around his. She'd found him again an hour later, after the speeches and the photo opportunities, standing alone outside the school, leaning against an old sedan that had seen better days. "Successful escape?" she'd asked. "I wouldn't call it successful." He gestured at the building. "I'm supposed to be setting up for tomorrow's book fair. Got distracted." "By what?" "Wondering if you'd want to get coffee sometime." The directness had startled her. Men usually approached her with rehearsed pitches and calculated charm. Daniel had just asked, simple and honest, like it was the easiest thing in the world. She should have said no, should have recognized the risk of letting someone like him, someone genuine, someone with complications, into her perfectly structured life. Instead, she'd said, "Tomorrow, 7 a.m. I have a board meeting at 9. Sup?" That first coffee had turned into breakfast. Breakfast had turned into late-night phone calls when neither of them could sleep, talking about everything and nothing. Her cutthroat world of mergers and acquisitions, his quiet life of parent-teacher conferences and bedtime stories. "You're different," he'd told her one night, 3 weeks in. They were sitting in his small kitchen after Sophie had gone to bed, drinking cheap wine because it was all he could afford. "Different how?" "You're not what I expected. The articles make you sound—" He'd paused, searching for words. "Cold. Calculating. I am cold and calculating. No." He'd reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. "You're careful. There's a difference." That was when she'd started falling. She'd tried to stop it, tried to maintain the boundaries that had always protected her. But Daniel had a way of looking at her, not at the CEO, not at the empire she'd built, but at the woman underneath all of it. The woman who worked 16-hour days because silence made her anxious, who ate dinner alone in a penthouse because she'd never learned how to let people close. He saw her, actually saw her, and it terrified her more than any hostile takeover ever had. "Mom's not coming back, is she?" Sophie's question, whispered one evening when Victoria had stayed for dinner, had frozen both adults in place. Daniel had knelt beside his daughter, his face carefully composed. "No, sweetheart, she's not." "Is Victoria going to leave too?" The raw fear in those 8-year-old eyes had struck Victoria like a physical blow. This child had already been abandoned once, already knew what it felt like to be left behind. "I'm not going anywhere," Victoria had heard herself say, the words escaping before her brain could intercept them. Daniel's eyes had found hers across the room, surprised, uncertain, hopeful. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, they'd talked. Her mother left when she was 3, Daniel had explained, his voice low. Just left. No warning, no explanation. I came home from work and found Sophie with a neighbor and a note on the table. What did it say? I can't do this anymore. His laugh had been bitter. 5 words. That's what 5 years of marriage was worth. I'm sorry. I spent 2 years trying to understand why. He'd stared at his hands. Therapy, self-help books, late nights driving myself crazy. Eventually I realized it doesn't matter why. What matters is that I have Sophie, and I'll never let her feel abandoned again. Is that why you haven't dated? Dated, sure. Let someone get close? He'd shaken his head. That's different. Sophie's already lost one parent. I won't risk bringing someone into her life who might leave. The unspoken question had hung between them. What about you? Victoria had stood to leave, recognizing the warning for what it was. She should have ended it then, should have protected them both from the inevitable collision between her world and his. But at the door, she'd turned back. I meant what I said to Sophie. Victoria, I don't make promises I can't keep, Daniel. It's bad for business. She'd allowed herself a small smile. And despite what the magazines say, I'm actually very good at business. He'd kissed her then, soft and desperate, and she'd kissed him back with a hunger that had nothing to do with ambition or control and everything to do with the terrifying realization that she was falling in love with a man whose life came with responsibilities she'd never imagined. The months that followed had been a careful dance. Victoria learned to navigate Sophie's world, school plays and soccer games and bedtime stories. She discovered that she was surprisingly good at braiding hair, that she actually enjoyed helping with homework, that watching Sophie's face light up when she walked through the door made something warm unfold in her chest. Daniel, in turn, had entered her world with curious eyes and zero pretension. He'd attended charity galas in borrowed suits, met her colleagues without trying to impress them, listened to her vent about hostile board members and incompetent executives. You're brilliant, he'd told her one night after a particularly brutal acquisition battle. You know that, right? I'm ruthless. You're both. He'd pulled her closer on the couch. And I love both sides of you. Love. They hadn't said it before. The word had hovered unspoken between them for weeks, too big and too dangerous to name. Daniel, you don't have to say it back. His voice had been steady, certain. I just needed you to know. But she had said it back, whispering it against his shoulder in the darkness of his bedroom while Sophie slept down the hall, feeling simultaneously powerful and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share. She loved him, and she loved Sophie, and for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Victoria had allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around conference rooms and corner offices. Then came the morning sickness. At first she'd ignored it. Stress, she'd told herself. Bad sushi. The flu going around the office. But when her period was 2 weeks late, denial became impossible. She'd bought the test during a business trip to Chicago in a pharmacy where no one would recognize her, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like some kind of celebrity fugitive. Ridiculous, she'd thought, standing in line with a pregnancy test hidden under a Wall Street journal. I'm a grown woman. I have nothing to be ashamed of. But shame wasn't the problem. Fear was. Because she knew what this would mean, knew the choice it would force on Daniel, a man who had explicitly, repeatedly told her he was done having children, who had built his entire life around protecting the daughter he already had, who had drawn a line in the sand and meant it. She'd waited until she was alone in her hotel room to take the test, hands trembling as she read the instructions. 3 minutes. She'd faced down hostile shareholders and aggressive competitors. She'd stared down men who wanted to see her fail, who whispered that she was too cold, too ambitious, too much. But 3 minutes waiting for 2 pink lines felt longer than every board meeting combined. When they appeared, clear and undeniable, Victoria had sat on the bathroom floor of a hotel room 1,000 miles from home and felt her carefully constructed world crack wide open. Pregnant. She'd flown back early, canceling meetings and ignoring her assistant's surprised protests. The entire flight, she'd stared out the window, running through scenarios. Tell him. Don't tell him. Keep the baby. Don't keep the baby. Each option felt impossible. She thought about Daniel's face when he talked about Sophie's mother, the betrayal, the anger, the fear of ever being hurt like that again. I'll never let her feel abandoned again. And now Victoria carried a child that Daniel had never wanted, a complication he'd specifically tried to avoid. She could not tell him, could handle this alone. She had money, resources, power. She didn't need a man to help her raise a child. But the thought of lying to Daniel, of keeping this secret, made her feel physically ill. They'd built something real, messy and imperfect and beautiful. She wouldn't poison it with deception, which left the truth that might destroy everything they'd created. What? That night, standing in her penthouse, Victoria had called him. Can I come over? Now? Daniel had sounded surprised. It was past 9 and he usually avoided late visits on school nights. Is everything okay? I need to talk to you. A pause. She could hear the concern in his silence. Sophie's already asleep, he'd said slowly. But yes, come over. The drive to his apartment had felt surreal. Victoria, who normally had a driver, had insisted on going alone, needing the time to think. The streets blurred past, familiar and foreign, all at once. Tell him the truth. Let him make his choice. But what if his choice was to leave? What if she was about to lose the only man who'd ever really known her? She'd parked outside his building, a modest complex in a neighborhood that still had corner stores and children playing in the streets. So different from her glass tower overlooking the city. 2 different worlds. And she was about to ask him to bridge them in a way he'd sworn never to do again. Victoria had checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, perfectly composed as always, not a hair out of place. The CEO armor she wore without thinking. But underneath it, she was terrified. She'd climbed the stairs to his 3rd-floor apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. Daniel had opened the door before she could knock, concern written across his face. Hey. He'd pulled her inside, hands gentle on her shoulders. What's wrong? And that was when Victoria realized she couldn't do this in a hallway, couldn't drop this bomb standing up. Can we sit? They'd settled on the couch, the same worn sofa where they'd watched movies and fallen asleep tangled together, where Sophie had fallen asleep between them during family movie nights. Daniel had waited, patient as always, while Victoria tried to find words for something that had no easy explanation. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was devastating. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. For a moment, Victoria wondered if he'd even heard her. Then he stood, walking to the window, his back to her. How long have you known? His voice was carefully neutral. 3 days. And you're sure? I took 4 tests, all positive. She forced herself to stay calm, to not let her voice break. I have a doctor's appointment scheduled for next week to confirm. But yes, I'm sure. He nodded slowly, still not looking at her. Victoria watched his shoulders, the tension in his spine, the way his hands gripped the windowsill. I know this isn't what you wanted, she said quietly. I know you were clear about... Don't. The word was sharp. Don't make this sound like a business deal, like I gave you parameters and you violated the agreement. That's not what I told you. He finally turned and the pain in his eyes nearly broke her. I told you from the beginning. No more kids. I can't do that again. I know. Do you? His laugh was hollow. Do you have any idea what it's like? The fear, every single day, that you're going to fail them? That you're not enough? His voice cracked. I barely survived it the first time, Victoria. And I had to do it alone because Sophie's mother decided parenting was too hard and just left. I'm not her. I know you're not. He ran his hands through his hair, pacing now. But that doesn't change the fear, doesn't change the fact that every time I look at Sophie, I'm terrified of letting her down, of not being enough. You are enough. You're an amazing father. Am I? Because most days I'm just guessing, making it up as I go, hoping I don't screw her up too badly. He stopped pacing, met her eyes. And now you want me to do it again? To take that risk with another child? I'm not asking you to do anything. What? Victoria stood, wrapping her arms around herself. I'm keeping the baby. That's not negotiable, but you don't have to be part of it. The words tasted like ash. You're serious? Yes. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I have resources, money. I can hire help. You can walk away, Daniel. No guilt, no obligation. Just like that? Just like that. He stared at her, something broken and angry in his expression. You think that's what I want? To abandon my child? I think you want to protect Sophie and yourself. I think you've been hurt badly, and I think this, she gestured between them, is exactly the scenario you've been trying to avoid. So what? You're giving me an out? I'm giving you a choice. No. Daniel shook his head. You're telling me you've already made your decision, and I get to decide if I'm in or out. That's not a choice. That's an ultimatum. It's not meant to be. I need time. He turned away again. I can't think about this right now. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Okay. Okay? He sounded surprised. Take your time. Think about what you want. She grabbed her purse, moving toward the door. I'll wait to hear from you. Victoria. But she was already leaving, walking down the hallway with measured steps, refusing to run even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She made it to her car before the tears came. Then, 3 days passed. 3 days of silence that felt like years. Victoria threw herself into work, taking meetings she normally would have delegated, reviewing contracts that didn't need her attention, staying at the office until midnight to avoid the emptiness of her penthouse. Her assistant noticed. Are you feeling all right, Ms. Hale? Fine, Victoria had lied, staring at spreadsheets that blurred together. Just busy. But she wasn't fine. She was pregnant and alone and terrified, and the man she loved was a phone call away but felt unreachable. On the 4th day, her doctor confirmed what the tests had already told her. About 6 weeks along, Dr. Morrison had said, smiling warmly. Everything looks good. Have you told the father? Yes. And how did he take it? Victoria had stared at the ultrasound screen, at the tiny blob that would become a person, and felt her throat close. He's processing. Doctor. Morrison had squeezed her hand. It's a lot to take in. Give him time. But how much time? And what if time only led to him walking away? That night, Victoria had stood in her penthouse, looking out at the city lights, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach. It's just us, she'd whispered. But that's okay. We'll be okay. The words felt like a promise and a lie all at once. On the 5th day, Daniel called. Victoria had been in a board meeting presenting quarterly projections when her phone buzzed. She'd glanced down, seen his name, and felt her heart stop. Excuse me, she'd told the room of executives, ignoring their surprised looks. I need to take this. She'd walked to her office, closed the door, taken a breath. Hello? Can we talk? Daniel's voice was quiet. In person? When? Now? I know you're probably busy, but I'll be there in 20 minutes. She'd canceled the rest of her meetings, grabbed her coat, and left, her assistant calling after her with a stack of documents that suddenly felt utterly unimportant. The drive to his apartment felt both too long and too short. Victoria rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd react if he told her he was out, how she'd keep her composure when her heart was breaking. But when she arrived, Daniel was waiting outside, Sophie's hand in his. Hi, Victoria. Sophie waved enthusiastically. Dad said we're going to the park. The park? Victoria looked at Daniel, confused. I thought we could talk while Sophie plays, he explained. If that's okay. It wasn't what she'd expected, but she nodded. Of course. The park was crowded with after-school energy, children running, parents chatting, the sound of laughter mixing with the rustle of early autumn leaves. Sophie ran ahead to the swings, leaving Daniel and Victoria alone on a bench. I've been thinking, Daniel started, watching his daughter, about what you said, about giving me a choice. Victoria waited, her hands clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. You were right. I was hurt, badly, and I built my life around never being that vulnerable again. He finally looked at her. But here's the thing. I already broke that rule. What? With you. His smile was sad. I told myself I wouldn't let anyone close, wouldn't risk Sophie getting attached to someone who might leave. But then you showed up at that stupid fundraiser with your designer dress and your sharp edges, and I couldn't help myself. Daniel, I fell in love with you knowing it was dangerous, knowing you could hurt us. He reached for her hand. So the question isn't whether I'm willing to take risks. I already am. Every day I'm with you is a risk. Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes. The question is whether I'm brave enough to take this next step. And are you? She whispered. Daniel looked at Sophie, swinging higher and higher, fearless and laughing. I don't know, he admitted. I'm terrified. The idea of having another child, of potentially failing again. He shook his head. It keeps me up at night. Then why did you call? Because losing you scares me more. The words hung between them, honest and raw. I need time, he continued. I need to work through this fear, but I don't want to work through it alone. His grip tightened on her hand. I want to figure this out together. Together? Yeah. He managed a real smile this time. If you'll have me. Victoria didn't trust herself to speak. She just nodded, letting the tears finally fall. Daniel pulled her close, and she buried her face in his shoulder, breathing him in, coffee and laundry detergent, and something uniquely him. We're going to be okay, he murmured. All of us. Victoria wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love was enough to overcome fear and trauma and all the complicated baggage they each carried. But as Sophie called out for them to watch her jump from the swings, as Daniel squeezed her hand and stood to join his daughter, Victoria felt something shift. Not certainty, not the elimination of fear, but hope, fragile and tentative and real. Maybe that would be enough. The weeks that followed were an exercise in learning to navigate uncertainty. Daniel didn't magically overcome his fears. Some mornings, Victoria would catch him staring into space, worry etched across his features. Other times, he'd pull her close with desperate intensity, as if afraid she might vanish. Talk to me, she'd urged one night after he'd been particularly quiet. They were in his apartment, Sophie asleep, the television playing something neither of them was watching. I keep thinking about the logistics, he'd admitted. You have your career, your life. I have Sophie, my job. How do we make this work? People do it every day. Not people like us. He gestured between them. You're a CEO. I'm a junior accountant living paycheck to paycheck. You have a penthouse. I have a one-bedroom apartment where Sophie sleeps on the couch because I can't afford anything bigger. Money doesn't matter. It does, though. His voice was frustrated. Not because I care about the difference in our bank accounts, but because I can't give this baby what you can. I can barely afford Sophie's school supplies. So we combine resources. Victoria, I'm serious. She turned to face him fully. You think I care about maintaining some kind of financial independence? I care about building a life with you, with all of you. But your penthouse is just a building. We'll find something that works for all of us. A real home, not a showpiece. Daniel had looked at her with something like wonder. You'd really leave your perfect penthouse for a family house in the suburbs? In a heartbeat. And she'd meant it. The penthouse had been a trophy, proof of her success. But it had also been lonely, beautiful and cold and empty. A home with Daniel and Sophie and their unborn child? That sounded like something worth building. They told Sophie on a Saturday morning, the three of them sitting at Daniel's small kitchen table. Victoria had been nervous in a way that board meetings never made her. This child's opinion mattered more than any shareholders. Sophie, we need to talk to you about something important, Daniel had started gently. Am I in trouble? No, sweetheart. Nothing like that. He'd glanced at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. You know how Victoria and I have been spending a lot of time together? Yeah, you're dating. Sophie had said it matter-of-factly, stealing a strawberry from Victoria's plate. Right. Well, something unexpected happened. Something good, but also something that's going to change our family. Are you getting married? Sophie's eyes had lit up. Not yet, Victoria had interjected, but maybe someday. First, we need to tell you something else. What? Victoria had taken a breath. I'm going to have a baby. You're going to have a little brother or sister. The silence that followed had been excruciating. Sophie had looked between them, processing. A baby? Yes. Like a real baby that lives with us? Eventually, yes. More silence. Sophie had picked at her napkin, not meeting their eyes. Will you still love me the same? The question had been so quiet, so heartbreakingly vulnerable. Daniel had immediately knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his. Sophie, look at me. When she did, tears streaming down her face, he'd continued firmly, My love for you doesn't get smaller. It doesn't divide. It grows. Having another child means my heart gets bigger, not that there's less room for you. Promise? I promise. You're my Sophie girl. Nothing will ever change that. What about Victoria? Sophie had turned to her, those big eyes full of fear. Will you stop loving me when the baby comes? Victoria had felt her own tears start. She'd moved to kneel beside Daniel, taking Sophie's other hand. Sophie, I didn't plan on loving you, she'd said honestly. I didn't plan on any of this. But you became one of the most important people in my life. That doesn't go away because there's a baby. That's permanent. Really? Really? Sophie had thrown her arms around both of them, crying into their shoulders. I want to be the best big sister, she'd sobbed. I want to help with everything. You will be, Daniel had promised. The absolute best. And watching father and daughter hold each other, Victoria had felt something settle in her chest. They were doing this, really doing this. It was terrifying and imperfect, and nothing like she'd planned. But it was real, and maybe that was enough. The first ultrasound had been scheduled for Victoria's 10th week. Daniel had rearranged his work schedule to attend, showing up at the medical building in a suit he normally saved for special occasions, looking nervous and determined. You didn't have to dress up, Victoria had teased, though she'd been touched by the effort. First time seeing my kid. Felt like it deserved a suit. My kid. The words had made her heart skip. The exam room had been quiet, clinical, the technician professional and efficient as she'd prepared the equipment. This might be cold, she'd warned, applying gel to Victoria's stomach. Daniel had stood beside the exam table, his hand finding Victoria's, squeezing tight. Then the image had appeared on the screen, grainy and unclear to an untrained eye, but the technician had pointed out the small form with practiced ease. There's your baby. Victoria had stared, trying to make sense of the black and white image. And here, the technician had turned on the sound. Is the heartbeat. The room had filled with a steady, rapid rhythm, so fast it didn't sound real. Daniel's grip on her hand had tightened almost painfully. That's... He'd leaned closer to the screen, transfixed. That's really our baby? Really yours, the technician had confirmed with a smile. For a moment, neither of them had spoken. They just listened to that impossible sound, proof of life, of possibility, of a future they were building together. Victoria had glanced up at Daniel and found tears streaming down his face. Daniel, I'm okay, he'd managed, voice thick. I forgot how beautiful this is. The technician had given them a moment, discreetly checking measurements while they processed. Everything looks good, she'd finally said. Healthy heartbeat, good size for dates. Do you want pictures? Yes, they'd answered simultaneously. Later, sitting in Victoria's car in the parking garage, they'd stared at the grainy ultrasound photos. When Sophie was this size, Daniel had said quietly, I was so scared. Her mother was already pulling away, and I knew I knew she was going to leave. I'd spend nights staring at ultrasound pictures like these, wondering how I was going to do it alone. You're not alone this time. No. He'd turned to her, his eyes red but clear. I'm not. And that makes all the difference. They'd sat there for a long time, hands intertwined, the ultrasound picture resting on the dashboard between them, a tiny photograph of a future they were just beginning to build. But fear didn't disappear overnight. 2 weeks after the ultrasound, Victoria had woken in the middle of the night to find Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. She'd been staying at his apartment more frequently, the distance between her penthouse and his life feeling less sustainable. Hey, she touched his shoulder. What's wrong? I had a dream. His voice had been hoarse. Sophie was calling for me, but I couldn't find her. And when I finally did, she told me I'd forgotten about her, that I loved the new baby more. Daniel. And the worst part was, in the dream, she was right. I had forgotten. I was so focused on the baby that I'd lost track of the one person who mattered most. Victoria had pulled him back into bed, wrapping herself around him. That won't happen. You don't know that. Yes, I do. She'd forced him to meet her eyes. Because you're already worried about it. Bad fathers don't lie awake at night terrified of failing their children. They just fail them and don't care. But what if worrying isn't enough? Then we course correct. Together. She'd pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heartbeat. You're not doing this alone, remember? He'd pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. I love you, he'd whispered. I'm sorry I'm such a mess about this. You're not a mess. You're human. She'd kissed his temple. And I love you too, all of you, including the scared parts. They'd fallen back asleep tangled together, and when morning came, Daniel had seemed lighter somehow. Not fixed, not fearless, but present. And that, Victoria was learning, was enough. As winter approached and Victoria's pregnancy became visible, they'd started house hunting. It had been surreal, looking at suburban homes with yards and multiple bedrooms, so different from the sleek urban spaces Victoria had always inhabited. What about this one? Daniel had asked during one weekend expedition, pointing to a craftsman-style house with a front porch and mature trees. It's nice. Just nice? Victoria had looked at the house, really looked. 3 bedrooms, an updated kitchen, a yard where Sophie could play and where their baby could eventually learn to walk. A home. Not a showcase, not an investment. A place to build a family. It's perfect, she'd corrected. Let's make an offer. The negotiation process had been strange. Normally, Victoria dominated business deals, but this felt different, more personal. She'd found herself wanting to know about the family selling it, whether they'd been happy there, what memories they'd made. You're getting sentimental, her real estate agent had observed. Maybe I am. 2 weeks later, the offer had been accepted. They'd moved in on a crisp December morning, a small army of movers handling Victoria's expensive furniture, while Daniel and Sophie carried boxes of books and toys. This room is mine. Sophie had claimed the largest bedroom, immediately planning where her bed would go. Victoria and Daniel had stood in what would become the nursery, empty and full of potential. We're really doing this, Victoria had said, looking around. Having second thoughts? Not even for a second. She'd turned to him. Are you? Daniel had pulled her close, his hand settling on her growing bump. Every day, he'd admitted. But I'm doing it anyway. That's called being brave. Is it? Feels more like being terrified and moving forward despite it. That's exactly what brave means. He'd kissed her then, soft and sure, and for a moment the empty room and uncertain future had faded away. This was real, this was happening, and they were in it together. Christmas had arrived with a blanket of snow and a sense of peace Victoria hadn't expected. They decorated the new house together, Sophie insisting on a massive tree, Daniel hanging lights with patient precision, Victoria discovering she actually enjoyed the chaos of holiday preparations. On Christmas morning, Sophie had torn through presents with gleeful abandon before turning to Victoria with serious eyes. I got something for the baby. She'd produced a small wrapped package, carefully decorated with crayon drawings. Inside was a stuffed elephant, well-loved and obviously one of Sophie's favorites. This was mine when I was little, Sophie had explained. It helped me when I was scared. I want the baby to have it. Victoria had felt her throat tighten. Sophie, you don't have to. I want to. The girl had placed the elephant carefully on Victoria's bump. I want them to know they have a big sister who will protect them. Daniel had turned away, clearly fighting tears. Victoria had pulled Sophie into a hug, overwhelmed by this child's capacity for love. Thank you, she'd whispered. This is the most special gift I've ever received. Later that evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys, Daniel and Victoria had sat by the tree, the lights casting soft shadows. I have something for you, Daniel had said, pulling out a small box. We said no gifts. This isn't a Christmas gift. Not really. He'd handed it to her, nervous in a way she'd rarely seen. Inside was a simple gold band. Victoria had stopped breathing. I'm not proposing, Daniel had said quickly. Not yet. I want to do that right, big gesture, down on one knee, the whole thing. But I wanted you to have this. A promise that I'm in this, completely. That when I'm ready to propose, I already know your answer. Daniel, you don't have to wear it. You don't even have to keep it if you don't want. She'd kissed him, silencing the nervous rambling. I'll wear it, she'd said against his lips, and I already know my answer too. He'd slipped the ring onto her right hand, and they'd sat there in the glow of the Christmas tree, planning a future that once seemed impossible. The new year had brought new challenges. Victoria's pregnancy had progressed smoothly, but her work had grown complicated. Board members had started making noises about maternity leave, about whether she could maintain her position while raising a child. Let them talk, Daniel had counseled. You've built that company. They need you more than you need them. But the whispers had stung. After years of being ruthless and untouchable, Victoria had discovered vulnerability, and corporate vultures could smell blood. She'd considered stepping back, taking a prolonged leave, but the idea of abandoning everything she'd built felt like betrayal of a different kind. What if I could do both? She'd wondered aloud one evening. Both? Run the company and raise a family. Women do it all the time. Yes, but you don't have to prove anything, Victoria. Not to them, not to anyone. Maybe I'm proving it to myself. Daniel had studied her face. Then do it. I'll support you either way. And he had. Through late-night conference calls and early morning sickness, through board meetings when her feet were swollen and her back ached, Daniel had been there, bringing her food, rubbing her shoulders, reminding her she was more than her job title. You're going to be an amazing mother, he'd told her. How do you know? Because you care this much about getting it right. February had brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria had been working from home, reviewing contracts in the nursery-to-be, when her doorbell rang. Daniel was at work. Sophie at school. She wasn't expecting anyone. The woman on her doorstep had been vaguely familiar, polished, professional, with calculating eyes that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of herself. Can I help you? Ms. Hale, I'm Jennifer Chen from the Financial Tribune. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Daniel Brooks. Victoria's blood had run cold. No comment. It's just that our readers are fascinated by your story. Powerful CEO, single father, unexpected pregnancy. Jennifer's smile had been sharp. It's quite the human interest piece. My personal life is not a story. Everything's a story, Ms. Hale. You of all people should know that. She'd pulled out a recorder. How does Mr. Brooks feel about becoming a father again? Is it true his ex-wife abandoned him? And how do you plan to balance? Victoria had shut the door in her face. But the damage was done. The article had run 2 days later, a speculative piece that twisted facts and invented drama, painting Victoria as a cold CEO who'd trapped a vulnerable single father and Daniel as either a gold digger or a victim, depending on which paragraph you read. This is garbage, Daniel had raged, throwing the paper across their kitchen. Complete fiction. Welcome to my world. They made it sound like I'm after your money, like you're using me for some kind of image rehabilitation. I know. We should sue. This is defamation, which would only make it bigger news. Victoria had taken his hands. We ignore it. It'll blow over. But it hadn't blown over. The story had been picked up by other outlets, each adding their own spin. Suddenly, their private life was public entertainment. Sophie had come home from school crying, saying kids were asking her weird questions about her dad and Victoria. That had been the breaking point for Daniel. "This isn't fair to her," he'd said that night, pacing their bedroom. "She didn't ask for any of this. None of us did." "But she's 8 years old, Victoria. She shouldn't have to defend her family to classmates who are just repeating garbage their parents read online." "What do you want me to do?" "I can't control the media." "I know. He'd sunk onto the bed, defeated. "I wanted to protect her from this." Victoria had sat beside him, her hand on his knee. "We can't shield them from everything, but we can show them how to handle it, how to stay strong when people try to tear us down. By ignoring it? By not giving them power over us." She'd forced him to meet her eyes. "I've dealt with this my entire career, Daniel. Tabloids, hit pieces, people who want to see me fail. The moment we let it change how we live, they win." He'd nodded slowly, understanding but still frustrated. "I hate this. So do I. But I love you more than I hate the attention." That had gotten a small smile. "Yeah?" "Yeah." They'd held each other as the media storm continued outside their door, finding strength in the quiet certainty that what they had was real, more real than any headline could capture. The weeks had continued, marked by doctor's appointments and nursery preparations, and small moments of joy that had nothing to do with press coverage or public opinion. Victoria's belly had grown round and undeniable. Strangers had started offering unsolicited advice, touching her without permission, asking invasive questions. "Is this what pregnancy is always like?" she'd asked Dr. Morrison. "The attention? Afraid so. Everyone becomes an expert when you're pregnant." But not Daniel. Daniel had been perfect, attentive without hovering, supportive without being overbearing. He'd learned what foods made her nauseous, which positions eased her back pain, how to tell when she needed space versus when she needed to be held. "How did you get so good at this?" she'd asked one night. "Practice. Sophie's mom had terrible morning sickness with her. I learned." It had been a rare mention of his ex-wife, usually a subject he avoided. "Do you ever wonder where she is?" "Sometimes. Mostly I wonder if she ever regrets leaving Sophie." And if she came back, Daniel had pulled Victoria closer. "She made her choice, and I made mine. I chose Sophie then, and I choose this family now." "Even with all the fear?" "Especially with the fear." He'd kissed her temple. "Because you're worth being brave for." Oh. March had arrived with early spring flowers and a sense of anticipation. Victoria was 7 months pregnant now, her due date approaching with terrifying speed. They'd attended birthing classes together, Daniel, Victoria, and sometimes Sophie, who'd been fascinated by the videos and unfazed by the graphic nature of childbirth. "That looks hard," she'd observed. "Very hard," the instructor had confirmed. "But you can do it, right, Victoria?" Sophie had looked at her with complete faith. "I'll certainly try." After class, driving home through spring rain, Daniel had been quiet. "What are you thinking?" Victoria had asked. "About that night, when Sophie was born." His hands had tightened on the steering wheel. "Her mother was in labor for 18 hours. I thought I was going to lose them both." "But you didn't." "No. But the fear was—" He'd shaken his head. "I'm not good with helplessness." "No one is." "I'll be better this time," he'd promised. "More present, less scared." "You're allowed to be scared, Daniel. But I don't want fear to be what you remember. I want—" He'd pulled into their driveway, turning to face her. "I want to be the partner you deserve. Strong and supportive and—" Victoria had stopped him with a kiss. "You already are." He'd rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "I love you. I love you too." And sitting in their driveway, rain drumming on the roof, Victoria had felt utterly certain of one thing. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That certainty, fragile and fierce, would carry them through everything still to come. April arrived with cherry blossoms and chaos. Victoria's water broke during a board meeting. She'd been standing at the head of the conference table, presenting the quarterly earnings report, when she felt the sudden warmth spreading down her legs. For a moment, she'd frozen, her mind refusing to process what was happening. "Ms. Hale?" One of the board members had leaned forward. "Are you all right?" Victoria had looked down at the puddle forming on the expensive carpet, then back at the room full of executives staring at her with various expressions of shock and alarm. "I need to go," she'd managed, her voice surprisingly steady. "Robert, you'll finish the presentation. But now." She'd walked out with as much dignity as possible, leaving behind a room of stunned silence. In the elevator, alone, she'd finally let herself panic. 3 weeks early. The baby was coming 3 weeks early. Her hands shook as she called Daniel. "Hey, I'm in a meeting. Can I call you back? My water broke." The line went silent for a heartbeat. "I'm on my way. Where are you?" "Leaving the office. I'll meet you at the hospital." "Victoria, you shouldn't drive." "I'm not going into labor in the back of a taxi. I'll be fine." She'd made it to the parking garage, into her car, and halfway to the hospital before the first real contraction hit. It felt like being split in half. Victoria had gripped the steering wheel, breathing through the pain, and for the first time understood why childbirth was called labor. This was work. Brutal, relentless work. When it passed, she'd pulled over, hands trembling, and called Daniel again. "I can't drive." "Where are you?" She'd given him the intersection, and 15 minutes later his old sedan had screeched to a stop beside her car. Daniel had jumped out, looking terrified and determined in equal measure. "Come on," he'd said, helping her into his passenger seat. "We're going to be okay." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Another contraction had hit before they made it to the highway, and Victoria had grabbed Daniel's hand so hard she'd left marks. "Breathe," he'd coached, his voice steady even as he drove 20 miles over the speed limit. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, just like we practiced." "I hate you," she'd gasped. "I know, you can hate me more later." Somehow, they'd made it to the hospital. Nurses had descended with a wheelchair and clipboard questions, and Victoria had been whisked away into the sterile efficiency of the maternity ward. Daniel had stayed at her side, refusing to leave even when the nurses suggested he might want to wait outside during the initial examination. "I'm not going anywhere," he'd said firmly. And he hadn't. Hours blurred together, contractions and breathing exercises, ice chips, and encouraging words that felt increasingly meaningless as the pain intensified. "I can't do this," Victoria had said at one point, exhausted and hurting. "Daniel, I can't." "Yes, you can." He'd wiped sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do anything." "This is different." "No, it's not. It's just a different kind of negotiation. Your body knows what to do." She'd wanted to argue, but another contraction had stolen her words. Somewhere around hour 6, Sophie had arrived with Daniel's sister, Emma, who'd agreed to watch her. The little girl had peeked into the room, eyes wide. "Is Victoria okay?" "She's working very hard," Daniel had explained. "The baby is almost here." "Can I stay?" "Not for this part, sweetheart, but soon." Sophie had hugged her father tightly. "Tell Victoria she's doing great." After they'd left, Daniel had relayed the message, and Victoria had found herself crying, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization of what was happening. She was becoming a mother. This fierce, terrifying, impossible thing was actually happening. "I'm scared," she'd admitted. "Me too," Daniel had confessed, "but we're scared together." At hour 8, Dr. Morrison had checked her progress and smiled. Almost there. Another hour, maybe 2. But it hadn't taken 2 hours. At 9:47 p.m., after one final agonizing push, their son had entered the world with a furious cry that filled the delivery room. "He's here," the doctor had announced, lifting the tiny, squirming baby. "You have a son." Victoria had stared in disbelief at the small, red-faced creature who was somehow hers. A nurse had quickly cleaned him and placed him on her chest, and the world had narrowed to the weight of him, the warmth, the impossible reality. "Hi," she'd whispered, touching his tiny hand with one finger. "Hi, baby." Daniel had leaned over them both, tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect," he'd breathed. "Victoria, he's absolutely perfect." Their son, they'd decided on Ethan weeks ago, had stopped crying at the sound of their voices, his unfocused eyes trying to find them. "Ethan Brooks," Victoria had said, testing the name. "Welcome to the chaos." Daniel had kissed her forehead, then gently touched Ethan's head. "Thank you," he'd murmured. "Thank you for this." Victoria had looked up at him, exhausted and elated and completely overwhelmed. "We did it. Yeah, we really did." For a moment, the hospital room had been perfect, just the three of them, wrapped in the fragile bubble of new life. Then reality had crashed back in the form of paperwork and additional nurses, and the overwhelming realization that they were now responsible for keeping this tiny human alive. "Do you want to hold him?" Victoria had asked Daniel. He'd hesitated, old fears flickering across his face, but then he'd nodded and carefully taken Ethan into his arms. The transformation had been immediate. Daniel's entire body had softened, his expression shifting into something Victoria had never quite seen before. Wonder mixed with terror, mixed with the deepest love. "Hey, little man," he'd said quietly. "I'm your dad. I'm going to try really hard not to mess this up." Ethan had yawned, completely unconcerned with his father's worries. "I think he trusts you," Victoria had observed. Poor judgment on his part. But he'd been smiling, that genuine smile that made Victoria's heart skip. They'd stayed like that for a long time, Daniel holding Ethan, Victoria watching them both, until a nurse had gently suggested they should probably get some rest. "Your sister called," the nurse had mentioned to Daniel. "She wants to know if Sophie can visit." Daniel had looked at Victoria, who'd nodded despite her exhaustion. "Let her come." 20 minutes later, Sophie had burst into the room with barely contained excitement. "Is that the baby? Can I see? Is it a boy or a girl? What's his name?" "Slow down," Daniel had laughed. "Come here." Sophie had approached cautiously, suddenly shy. When she'd finally looked at Ethan, her entire face had lit up. "He's so tiny." "You were even tinier," Daniel had told her. "Really?" "Really. Want to hold him?" Sophie had nodded eagerly, and Daniel had carefully transferred Ethan to his daughter's lap, keeping his hands nearby for support. "Hi, Ethan," Sophie had whispered, completely mesmerized. "I'm your big sister. I'm going to teach you everything." Victoria had felt tears prickling again. The image of Sophie holding her brother with such gentle reverence was almost too much. "You're a natural," Victoria had said. "Can I come visit every day?" "As much as you want," Daniel had promised. "This is your brother. You're part of this." Sophie had looked up, her expression serious. "I'm going to be the best big sister ever." "I know you will." They'd stayed for another hour, Sophie chattering about all the things she'd teach Ethan, how to tie shoes, how to ride a bike, which teachers at school were nice, and which ones gave too much homework. When Emma had finally insisted they needed to leave so Victoria could rest, Sophie had carefully kissed Ethan's forehead. "Bye, little brother. I'll see you tomorrow." After they'd left, the room had fallen quiet again. Daniel had settled into the chair beside Victoria's bed, Ethan back in his arms, and they'd simply existed together, a new family, still figuring out what that meant. "How are you feeling?" Daniel had asked. "Like I was hit by a truck." "That's fair." But also, Victoria had reached out to touch Ethan's tiny hand. Happy, terrified, completely overwhelmed. Same. They'd sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Ethan sleep. "Do you want me to stay tonight?" Daniel had finally asked. "I can sleep in the chair." "You don't have to." "I want to, if you'll let me." Victoria had nodded, too tired to argue, too grateful for his presence to send him away. Daniel had settled in, Ethan in the hospital bassinet between them, and they'd tried to sleep, though every small sound from the baby had them both jolting awake. "This is going to be our life now," Victoria had observed around 3 a.m. after Ethan's fourth feeding. "Exhausted and anxious?" "Pretty much." "Can't wait," Daniel had said, and somehow he'd sounded like he meant it. The next morning had brought a parade of visitors, Victoria's assistant with flowers and concerned questions about work, a few board members who'd heard the news, Daniel's sister with breakfast and congratulations. But the most important visitor had arrived around noon, Victoria's mother. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since Victoria had chosen her career over family expectations, not since her mother had made it clear that a CEO daughter was not the daughter she'd wanted. But there she stood in the doorway, looking older than Victoria remembered, her eyes locked on the bassinet. "Mom," Victoria had managed, shocked into speechlessness. "Victoria." Her mother had stepped inside, hesitant. I heard about the baby. I wanted... She'd trailed off, approaching the bassinet slowly. Ethan had been awake, his tiny fists waving aimlessly, and Victoria's mother had stared at him with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. "May I?" she'd asked quietly. Victoria had glanced at Daniel, who'd nodded encouragingly. Of course. Her mother had picked up Ethan with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, and something in her face had softened completely. "He's beautiful," she'd whispered. "What's his name?" "Ethan. Ethan Brooks." "Ethan." Her mother had tested the name, still focused on the baby. "Hello, Ethan. I'm your grandmother. Your..." The word had hung in the air, grandmother, carrying implications neither Victoria nor her mother had addressed. "Mom, this is Daniel," Victoria had introduced, needing to fill the silence. "Ethan's father." Daniel had stood, extending his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Hale." "Please, call me Catherine." She'd shaken his hand, still holding Ethan with one arm. "You're the single father." "That's me." "And you have a daughter from a previous marriage?" "Yes, Sophie, she's 8. Catherine had studied him with sharp eyes that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of herself. "This must be complicated for you." "It is," Daniel had admitted, "but it's worth it." Something in Catherine's expression had shifted, approval maybe, or at least respect. "I'm glad to hear it." She turned back to Victoria. "May I sit?" They'd talked for an hour, carefully at first, dancing around 3 years of silence and hurt, but gradually finding common ground in the tiny human sleeping between them. "I was harsh when you took the CEO position," Catherine had finally admitted. "I thought you were choosing ambition over happiness." "I was. But you found both anyway." Victoria had looked at Daniel, at Ethan, at the life she'd somehow built despite all her careful plans falling apart. "I did, just not in the order I expected. Your father would have been proud." The mention of Victoria's father, dead for 5 years now, had brought fresh tears. "You think so?" "I know so. He always said you'd do something extraordinary." Catherine had smiled sadly. "I don't think he meant just in business." Before leaving, Catherine had hugged Victoria, the first real embrace in years. "Don't wait so long next time," she'd whispered. "I want to know my grandson." "You will," Victoria had promised. "I want that too." After she'd left, Daniel had pulled Victoria close. "That went better than expected. I didn't even know she was coming." "Are you glad she did?" Victoria had thought about it, about the years of distance, about pride and hurt feelings, about how Ethan had somehow bridged a gap she'd thought unbridgeable. "Yeah," she'd decided. "I am." 2 days later, they'd brought Ethan home. The house, their house, with its 3 bedrooms and backyard, had felt both familiar and completely foreign. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. Sophie had helped prepare the nursery, arranging stuffed animals and making sure the elephant she'd given was prominently displayed. "He needs to see it when he wakes up," she'd insisted. That first night, Victoria had sat in the rocking chair they'd bought, Ethan in her arms, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her like a physical thing. This tiny person depended on her completely. The thought was paralyzing. "What if I'm not enough?" she'd asked Daniel, who'd been assembling the changing table at 2 a.m. because Ethan's sleep schedule was non-existent. "What if I don't know how to do this?" "Then we figure it out together." He'd set down the screwdriver, coming to sit beside her. "Nobody knows what they're doing at first." "You did, with Sophie. Victoria, I cried every night for the first month. I had no idea what I was doing." He'd touched Ethan's head gently. "I just kept showing up and hoping that would be enough." "And was it?" "Sophie turned out pretty great, so I guess so." Ethan had stirred, making the small grunting sounds that preceded crying, and Victoria had automatically started rocking. "Look at that," Daniel had observed. "You already know what to do. This is just instinct." "Yeah, and instinct is a pretty good start." The weeks that followed had been a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning Ethan's different cries and what each one meant, of discovering that love could be exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Victoria had taken a leave from work. 3 months, she'd told the board, though she'd checked emails obsessively and taken calls during nap times. "You're supposed to be resting," Daniel had chided, finding her on her laptop at midnight while nursing Ethan. "I am resting. I'm sitting down. That's not what maternity leave means. I can't just abandon everything I've built. Nobody's asking you to abandon anything, but maybe you could, I don't know, actually recover from pushing a human out of your body? Victoria had glared at him, but she'd closed the laptop. Daniel had been on parental leave too. His company offered 2 weeks, which he'd stretched into 4 by using vacation time. They'd fallen into a rhythm of sorts. Victoria handling night feeding since she was nursing, Daniel taking mornings so she could sleep in, both of them stumbling through the day like zombies. Sophie had been surprisingly helpful, entertaining Ethan when he was fussy, helping with laundry, even attempting to cook dinner one night with results that were more enthusiastic than edible. "This is really good, Sophie," Daniel had lied, choking down burnt pasta. "You're a terrible liar, Dad." "Okay, it's terrible, but you tried, and that's what matters." They'd ordered pizza instead, eating it on the living room floor while Ethan slept in his swing, and Victoria had thought, this is family. Not perfect, not magazine-worthy, but real, and messy, and hers. One evening, about 6 weeks after Ethan's birth, Victoria had found herself crying in the shower for no reason she could name. The tears had come without warning, sudden and overwhelming, and she'd slid down the tile wall, sobbing into her knees. Daniel had found her there 20 minutes later, still crying, the water running cold. "Hey!" He'd turned off the shower, wrapped her in a towel. "What's wrong?" "I don't know." The words had come out between gasps. "Everything. Nothing. I can't stop crying." "Okay. That's okay." "It's not okay. I'm fine. Everything's fine. I should be happy." "Victoria." He'd made her look at him. "You just had a baby. Your hormones are everywhere. You're not sleeping. This is completely normal." "I don't feel normal. I feel like I'm losing my mind." "Have you talked to your doctor about this?" "It's not postpartum depression. I'm just tired." "Maybe. Or maybe you need help." His voice had been gentle but firm. "There's no shame in that." She'd called Dr. Morrison the next day, who'd confirmed what Daniel had suspected. Postpartum hormones combined with sleep deprivation and the stress of adjusting to a new baby had created a perfect storm. "It's very common," the doctor had assured her. "We can talk about medication if you want, or therapy, or just strategies for coping." Victoria had chosen therapy, video sessions with a counselor who specialized in postpartum adjustment. "You're grieving your old life," the therapist had explained during their second session. "That's normal. You can love your baby and still miss who you were before." "I shouldn't miss it. I chose this." Choice doesn't eliminate grief. You're allowed to feel both things. It had taken weeks, but slowly, Victoria had found her footing. The crying jags had lessened. Sleep had improved, marginally. And she'd started to recognize herself again in the mirror, not just as Ethan's mother, but as Victoria Hale, CEO, partner, woman who was still figuring out how all these identities fit together. "I want to go back to work," she'd told Daniel one morning. "Okay. You're not going to argue?" "Why would I? You love your job. And you're allowed to love both your job and our son. The board thinks I should choose. Then the board is full of idiots." He'd bounced Ethan gently. "What do you want?" Victoria had thought about it, really thought. "I want part-time, 3 days a week in the office, 2 from home, and I want to bring Ethan when I need to." "Then do it." "They're not going to like it. So make them like it. You're Victoria Hale. You've made hostile shareholders bend to your will. A few sexist board members should be easy." She'd laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. "I love you." "Love you too. Now go take a shower before Ethan needs to eat again." The conversation with the board had gone exactly as Daniel predicted. Poorly at first, then grudgingly accepting when Victoria made it clear this was not a negotiation. 3 days in office, 2 remote. I'll maintain my current output and availability. If performance drops, we can revisit. But I'm betting it won't. "And the baby?" one of the older board members had asked skeptically. "What about him?" "You can't bring an infant to board meetings." "Watch me." She'd done exactly that the following week, Ethan in a carrier against her chest while she presented new acquisition targets. He'd slept through most of it, and when he'd started to fuss, she'd simply nursed him while continuing to discuss profit margins. The board had been scandalized. Victoria hadn't cared. Any questions? She had asked once Ethan was satisfied and drowsing against her. Silence. Good. Let's move on to the Henderson deal. Later, her assistant had pulled her aside. Ms. Hale, I have to say that was the most badass thing I've ever seen. What, nursing during a meeting? Refusing to pretend the baby doesn't exist. Half the executives here have kids, but they act like family life is something that happens off-screen. She'd smiled. You made it real. I'm just doing what works for me. Maybe, but it's also changing things. Victoria had thought about that conversation for days. She hadn't meant to make a statement, hadn't intended to become some kind of symbol for working mothers. But maybe that's what happened when you refuse to hide parts of yourself to make others comfortable. Meanwhile, at home, Daniel had been navigating his own challenges. His company had been less understanding about extended leave, and when he'd returned to work, his boss had made pointed comments about dedication and priorities. I need to leave at 5 to pick up Sophie, Daniel had explained, and I can't do overnight travel right now. Everyone makes sacrifices, Brooks. I am making sacrifices. I'm just not sacrificing my kids. The tension had built until Daniel had come home one evening looking defeated. They're pushing me out, he'd told Victoria. Nothing official, but I'm being excluded from projects, passed over for promotions. They want me gone. Then quit. And do what? We have a mortgage, 2 kids. We have my income, which is substantial. Victoria had taken his hand. You could stay home with Ethan, or find something with better hours, or go back to school if you want. I can't let you support us. Why not? You supported Sophie alone for years. Let someone help for once. Daniel had looked at her for a long moment. You're serious. Completely. Daniel, you're miserable there. I can see it eating at you. Life's too short to spend it somewhere you're not valued. But no buts. We'll figure out the logistics. But I'm not watching you sacrifice your happiness for a job that doesn't appreciate you. He'd quit 2 weeks later, and the relief on his face had been worth any financial adjustment. I'm going to take a few months, he'd decided. Stay home with Ethan, figure out what I actually want to do. Sounds perfect. And it had been. Daniel had thrived as a stay-at-home parent, managing the household, taking Ethan to baby classes, picking Sophie up from school. I forgot how much I actually enjoy this, he'd admitted one evening. With Sophie, I was always stressed about money, about doing it alone. But this, with you, it's different. Good different? The best different. Months passed and their family found its rhythm. Victoria worked 3 days a week, cherishing her time at home. Daniel had started taking online courses in data analytics, something he could do while Ethan napped. Sophie had adjusted beautifully to her role as big sister, showing Ethan off to friends with obvious pride. They'd started going to the park on Saturday mornings, all 4 of them, like a normal family. Except they weren't normal, Victoria had realized. They were extraordinary. Not because they were perfect, but because they'd chosen each other despite fear, despite complications, despite every logical reason to walk away. And that choice, renewed every day, was the foundation of everything they were building. On a humid morning in late August, when Ethan was 4 months old, Daniel's phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in 5 years. He'd been in the kitchen, Ethan strapped to his chest in a carrier while he attempted to make lunch. The baby had been fussy all morning, refusing to nap, and Daniel had resorted to constant movement to keep him calm. The name on the screen made him freeze. Rachel, Sophie's mother. The woman who'd walked out without warning, who'd sent divorce papers through a lawyer and never looked back. Daniel stared at the phone, his heart pounding, until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again. Daniel? Victoria called from her home office, where she was on a video conference. Everything okay? Yeah, he managed, but his voice sounded strange even to himself. Fine. The phone stopped ringing, started again. This time he answered. Hello? Daniel? Her voice was exactly as he remembered. Soft, uncertain, the voice that had once promised forever. It's me. It's Rachel. I know. He sat down heavily, one hand supporting Ethan's head. What do you want? I know I have no right to call. I know that. But I wanted to talk to you about Sophie. Daniel's entire body went cold. What about Sophie? I want to see her. The world tilted sideways. No. Daniel, please. You left. You abandoned your daughter when she was 3 years old. You don't get to just call and, I made a mistake. Rachel's voice cracked. I know I made a terrible mistake. I was young and scared and I thought I couldn't handle it. But Daniel, I've changed. I've been in therapy, I've worked on myself, and I want to be part of her life. After 5 years? You want to be part of her life after 5 years of silence? Yes. Daniel stood, pacing the kitchen, trying to keep his voice down so Victoria wouldn't hear. Ethan squirmed against his chest, picking up on his tension. You have no idea what you did to her, he said, his voice shaking. She cried for you every night for months. She asked me over and over why you left, if she'd done something wrong, if you were coming back. Do you understand what that did to an 8-year-old? I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix it. Sorry doesn't erase 5 years of her thinking her mother didn't love her enough to stay. That's not true. I did love her. I do love her. I was just... What? Too busy? Too selfish? Daniel's anger was rising, hot and fierce. You didn't even send birthday cards, Rachel. Nothing. You disappeared like she never existed. I thought it would be easier for her if I made a clean break. Easier? Daniel laughed bitterly. It nearly destroyed her. A long silence followed. Daniel could hear Rachel breathing on the other end, could imagine her in whatever new life she'd built while they'd struggled without her. I want to make it right, she finally said. Please, let me try. No. Daniel, you gave up your rights when you left. Legally, emotionally, every way that matters. Sophie has a family now, a real family that shows up for her. I heard about your girlfriend, the CEO, and the baby. Rachel's voice had an edge now. Is that what this is about? Your new perfect family? This is about protecting my daughter from someone who already broke her heart once. I'm her mother. No. You're the woman who gave birth to her. That's biology, not motherhood. He hung up before she could respond, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Victoria appeared in the doorway moments later. Who was that? Daniel looked at her, at the concern in her eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. Sophie's mother. She wants back in her life. Victoria's expression shifted from concern to steel. What did you tell her? No, absolutely not. Good. She crossed to him, placing a hand on his back. Are you okay? I don't know. He looked down at Ethan, who'd finally fallen asleep against him. I thought I was past this, past her. But hearing her voice brought it all back. Yeah. Victoria guided him to the couch, sitting beside him. What are you going to do? Nothing. She doesn't get to waltz back in after 5 years and pretend nothing happened. But legally, she signed away her parental rights in the divorce. She has no legal claim. Then it's settled. But Daniel shook his head. What if Sophie wants to see her? When she's older, what if she asks about her mother and I've denied her that chance? Then you explain why you made that choice. To protect her. What if she resents me for it? Victoria took his hand, squeezing gently. You're borrowing trouble from a future that might never happen. Right now, Sophie is happy. She has you, she has me, she has Ethan. Don't let Rachel's sudden reappearance poison that. Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted to simply block Rachel's number and move on, but the doubt had taken root. Over the next few days, Rachel called repeatedly. Daniel didn't answer, but she left voicemails, apologies and explanations, promises that she'd changed, pleas for just one conversation with Sophie. I'm her mother, one message said. She deserves to know me. Daniel had deleted it, but the words lingered. He hadn't told Sophie about the calls, didn't know how to explain that the mother who'd abandoned her suddenly wanted back in. But Sophie wasn't stupid. She'd noticed his distraction, the way he'd been checking his phone constantly, the tension in his shoulders. Dad, she asked one evening while they were doing homework together, is something wrong? No, sweetheart. Why? You seem sad. Daniel set down the pencil he'd been holding. I'm not sad. Just thinking about grown-up stuff. Is it about Ethan or Victoria? No, they're both perfect. Sophie studied him with those two perceptive eyes. Is it about my mom? The question hit like a physical blow. What makes you ask that? I heard you on the phone the other day. You said her name. Daniel closed his eyes, cursing himself for not being more careful. Yeah, it's about your mom. Is she okay? She's fine. He pulled Sophie onto his lap, even though she was getting too big for it. She called me, wanted to talk. About me? Yes. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing. Does she want to see me? She said she does. Do you want me to see her? Daniel's throat tightened. That's not my decision to make alone. But what do you think? He held her tighter, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, remembering all the nights he'd held her while she cried for a mother who'd never come back. I think, he said carefully, that I'm scared. I'm scared of you getting hurt again. But I also know you're not a little kid anymore. You're old enough to have opinions about this. I don't remember her very much, Sophie admitted. Just little things, like she used to sing this song at bedtime. But I don't remember her face. That's okay. Is it weird that I don't miss her? Everyone says you're supposed to miss your mom, but I don't. I have you, and Victoria, and Ethan. We're a family. Daniel felt tears prickling. We are a family, a really good one. Then why does she get to come back and mess it up? She doesn't, not if we don't let her. Sophie pulled back to look at him. I don't want to see her, Dad. Not now. Maybe when I'm older and it won't hurt so much. But right now, I just want things to stay the way they are. Relief flooded through Daniel so intensely he felt dizzy. Okay, then that's what we'll do. You're not mad? Why would I be mad? Because she's my mom. I should want to know her. Sophie, listen to me. He made her meet his eyes. You don't owe anyone a relationship, not because of biology, not because of what other people think you should feel. If you're not ready, you're not ready. And that's completely okay. Promise? Promise. She hugged him tightly, and Daniel held on, grateful for this child's wisdom, for her strength, for the way she'd somehow turned out so beautifully despite everything. That night, after Sophie was asleep, he told Victoria about the conversation. She doesn't want to see Rachel. How do you feel about that? Relieved, guilty for being relieved, worried that I'm somehow influencing her decision. You're not. Victoria was nursing Ethan, the baby's eyes already drooping. She's a smart kid. She knows what she needs. I should still respond to Rachel, tell her Sophie's decision. Do you want me to do it? As a buffer? Daniel considered, then shook his head. No, this is my responsibility. He'd called Rachel the next morning while Sophie was at school and Ethan was napping. She'd answered on the first ring. Daniel, thank you for calling back. I was starting to think. I talked to Sophie. A pause. And? She doesn't want to see you. Not now. But I'm her mother. Biologically, yes. But you haven't been her mother in 5 years. She has a life, Rachel. A good life. And she's not ready to disrupt that. Can I just talk to her? Just once? No. Daniel, please. She's 8 years old. She gets to decide who she wants in her life. And right now, that's not you. He could hear Rachel crying on the other end. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, she said through tears. I know I messed up in the worst way possible, but I love her. I never stopped loving her. Then respect her wishes. If she changes her mind someday, I won't stop her from reaching out. But you don't get to force this. What if she never changes her mind? Then that's the consequence of your choices. The words were harsh, but Daniel couldn't find it in himself to soften them. I'm sorry, Rachel whispered, for everything. I'm so sorry. Me too. He'd hung up and sat in the silence of his house, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over him. Victoria had found him there an hour later. How did it go? I told her no. She cried. I felt terrible and relieved in equal measure. That sounds about right. Daniel pulled her down beside him on the couch. Thank you. For what? For being here. For loving Sophie like she's yours. For giving me a family I didn't think I deserved. Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. You deserve everything good, Daniel Brooks. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. How's that? Like someone brave enough to build something beautiful from broken pieces. He kissed her temple, holding her close. We built it together. Yeah, we did. The Rachel situation had settled, but it had stirred something in Daniel, a recognition of how fragile their happiness was, how easily it could be threatened. That night, Unable to sleep, he'd gotten out of bed and retrieved the small velvet box he'd hidden in his drawer months ago. The engagement ring he'd bought before Ethan was born, when everything had felt uncertain and terrifying. He'd planned to wait, to find the perfect moment, the perfect words. But sitting in the darkness of their bedroom, Victoria asleep beside him, Ethan breathing softly in his bassinet, Daniel realized there would never be a perfect moment, just this moment. This imperfect, beautiful now. He'd slipped back into bed, tucking the box under his pillow, and started planning. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Daniel had convinced Victoria they needed a family day at the beach. The beach? Ethan's 5 months old. Perfect beach age. We'll bring an umbrella. It's supposed to be hot. We'll go early. Come on, it'll be fun. Victoria had given him a suspicious look, but agreed. They'd packed up the car, an impressive amount of gear for 4 people, and driven to a quiet stretch of coastline Daniel had scouted earlier in the week. By the time they arrived, the sun was just starting to climb, painting the ocean in shades of gold and blue. Sophie had run immediately to the water, shrieking at the cold waves. Victoria had set up their umbrella, settling Ethan in a portable bassinet with practiced efficiency. "This is nice," she'd admitted, watching Sophie play. "Good thinking. I have my moments." They'd spent the morning building sandcastles and hunting for shells, Ethan content to watch from the shade. It was peaceful in a way their lives rarely were. No work emails, no responsibilities, just sun and sand and family. Around noon, Daniel had suggested a walk. "Just the 2 of us? What about Ethan?" "Sophie can watch him for a few minutes. Right, Soph?" "I got him, Dad." Victoria had looked between them, clearly sensing something. "What's going on?" "Nothing. Just want to walk with my girlfriend." They'd strolled down the beach, waves lapping at their feet, and Daniel had felt his heart pounding against his ribs. "So," he'd started, then stopped. "So?" Victoria prompted, amused. "I've been thinking. Dangerous. About us. About how we got here. Daniel, if this is about Rachel." "It's not." He'd stopped walking, turning to face her. "It's about how you came into my life at exactly the wrong time and turned out to be exactly the right person." Victoria had gone very still. "It's about how you love Sophie like she's yours. How you made room in your perfect, controlled life for chaos and mess and me. Daniel, it's about how every day I wake up grateful that you said yes to coffee, yes to complications, yes to building something neither of us planned but both of us needed." He'd reached into his pocket, pulling out the velvet box, and Victoria's hand had flown to her mouth. "I've been terrified of this moment," he'd admitted. "Terrified of not being enough, of asking you to give up too much, of all the ways I could fail you and Ethan and Sophie. You could never—" "Let me finish." He'd opened the box, revealing the simple diamond ring. "But I realized something. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up anyway. And you've shown up for me, for Sophie, for this life we're building, even when it was scary and uncertain and nothing like what you planned." Tears were streaming down Victoria's face now. "So I'm asking you, Victoria Hale, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing up for you the way you've shown up for us?" For a moment she couldn't speak, just stood there crying, her hands shaking. Then she'd nodded, laughing through tears. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Daniel had slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and she'd kissed him with the kind of desperate joy that made his chest ache. "I love you," she'd whispered against his lips. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good. We can be terrified together." They'd walked back to find Sophie dancing around Ethan's bassinet, clearly in on the plan. "Did she say yes? Did she?" "She said yes," Daniel confirmed, grinning. Sophie had hugged Victoria so hard they'd nearly fallen over. "Now you're really going to be my mom." "I've been your mom for a while now, sweetheart. This just makes it official." They'd spent the rest of the day celebrating on the beach, building the world's most elaborate sandcastle, eating sandy sandwiches, taking dozens of pictures with Victoria's ring catching the sunlight. That evening, exhausted and sunburned and happy, they'd driven home as a family, an engaged family. The weeks that followed had been a whirlwind of wedding planning layered onto the already chaotic reality of work and childcare. Victoria had wanted something small and simple. No, her mother had declared when told. Absolutely not. You're Victoria Hale. This wedding will be an event. Mom, small ceremony if you must, but there will be a reception. There will be dancing. This is non-negotiable. Daniel had stayed wisely out of it, letting Victoria and Catherine hash out the details. Your mother is terrifying, he'd observed after one particularly intense planning session. Now you know where I get it from. They'd settled on a compromise. Intimate ceremony on the beach where Daniel had proposed, followed by a larger reception at a venue Victoria's mother had chosen. The wedding date was set for early December, giving them 3 months to prepare. 3 months that flew by in a blur of dress fittings and flower selections and Sophie's excitement about being a junior bridesmaid. Can Ethan be in the wedding too? She'd asked. He'll be 7 months old. What would he do? Be cute. That's his job. They'd found a miniature tuxedo that made Ethan look like the world's tiniest businessman, and Sophie had declared it perfect. Through all the planning, normal life continued. Victoria had returned to work full-time, having proven to the board that motherhood hadn't diminished her effectiveness. If anything, she'd become more efficient, ruthlessly prioritizing in a way she never had before. Daniel had finished his data analytics certification and started consulting part-time, working from home so he could still manage most of Ethan's care. I actually like this setup, he'd told Victoria. Working enough to feel productive, but not so much I miss everything. Revolutionary concept, work-life balance. Wild, right? They'd settled into their roles, each supporting the other, neither sacrificing everything but both compromising where it mattered. It wasn't the traditional setup, the male CEO and stay-at-home wife, but it was theirs, and it worked. Sophie had thrived too. Her grades were excellent, she'd made new friends at school, and she'd started taking piano lessons, practicing diligently every evening. She's really good, the piano teacher had told them. Has she considered competing? Sophie had been shy about it, but with encouragement, she'd entered a local competition and placed third in her age group. The pride on her face when they'd brought her home with a ribbon had been worth everything. You're amazing, Soph, Victoria had told her. It's just third place. Third place out of 40 kids, that's incredible. That night, Daniel had found Sophie in her room, looking at the ribbon. Proud of yourself? He'd asked. Yeah, is that okay? Being proud? Absolutely. You worked hard, you earned this. Mom would have been proud too, right? My birth mom? The question had caught Daniel off guard. I think so, yeah. Why? I was just thinking, I'm glad she's not here. Is that bad? Daniel had sat on her bed, pulling her close. It's honest, and honest isn't bad. I used to wish she'd come back, but now I have Victoria, and it feels like she's the mom I was supposed to have all along. You can love them both, you know, or neither, or just one. There's no right way to feel. I know, but I just wanted you to know. I'm happy with our family exactly how it is. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. The night before the wedding, Victoria had stayed at her mother's house, tradition dictating they sleep apart. Daniel had lain awake in their empty bed, Ethan in his bassinet nearby, Sophie asleep down the hall, and thought about how far they'd come. From that first coffee to this moment, from fear to faith, from broken pieces to something whole. His phone had buzzed with a text from Victoria. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about tomorrow. He'd smiled, typing back. Nervous? Excited. Terrified. All of it. Me too. I love you, Daniel Brooks. See you at the altar. Can't wait, future Mrs. Brooks. Actually, I'm keeping my name. Even better. See you tomorrow, Ms. Hale. Daniel had set down his phone and closed his eyes, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. The morning of the wedding arrived with crystalline winter sunlight and a sky so blue it looked painted. Daniel had woken at dawn, unable to sleep, his stomach churning with anticipation. Ethan had stirred in his bassinet, making the small grunting sounds that preceded his morning demands for food. Hey, buddy, Daniel had whispered, lifting his son. Big day today. Your dad's getting married. Ethan had responded by drooling on Daniel's shoulder, which felt like an appropriate reality check. Sophie had appeared in the doorway moments later, already dressed in her junior bridesmaid outfit despite the ceremony being hours away. I couldn't sleep either, she'd admitted. Too excited? And scared Victoria might change her mind. Daniel had pulled her into a one-armed hug, Ethan squished between them. She's not changing her mind. She loves us. All of us. You promise? I promise. They'd spent the morning in a nervous blur of activity, feeding Ethan, getting dressed, triple-checking that Daniel had the rings, fielding anxious calls from Catherine about timing and flowers and 100 other details. By the time they arrived at the beach, Daniel's hands were shaking. The ceremony area had been transformed. White chairs arranged in neat rows, an arch draped with fabric and winter flowers, the ocean providing a backdrop so perfect it seemed unreal. A small crowd had already gathered, Victoria's colleagues, Daniel's friends, family members from both sides. Not the massive event Catherine had originally envisioned, but not exactly intimate either. Daniel had stood at the altar with Sophie beside him, Ethan in his arms, and waited. The music had started, a string quartet playing something classical and beautiful, and the guests had stood. Then Victoria had appeared at the end of the aisle. Daniel's breath had caught in his throat. She'd worn a simple dress, cream-colored, elegant without being ostentatious, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way she never wore it for work. No corporate armor, no CEO mask, just Victoria, beautiful and real and his. Their eyes had met across the distance, and she'd smiled, that private smile reserved only for him, and started walking. Catherine had been beside her, giving away the bride with tears already streaming down her face. As they'd reached the altar, Catherine had leaned in to whisper something to Victoria, then kissed her cheek before placing her daughter's hand in Daniel's. "Hi," Victoria had said softly. "Hi yourself." He'd squeezed her hand, trying to memorize this moment. "You look incredible." "So do you, all three of you." The officiant had cleared his throat, and the ceremony had begun. Daniel had barely heard the words. He'd been too focused on Victoria's face, on the way her eyes stayed locked on his, on the reality that this remarkable woman had chosen him. When it came time for vows, Victoria had gone first. "Daniel," she'd started, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "When I met you, I thought I had my life figured out. I thought success meant corner offices and quarterly earnings and a life measured in achievements. Then you showed me that real success is measured in moments, in Saturday morning pancakes and bedtime stories and choosing to love even when it's terrifying." Her voice had wavered slightly. "You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure, that building a family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up every day and choosing each other." She'd looked at Sophie, then at Ethan. "You gave me a family I didn't know I needed. You made me a mother before I ever gave birth. And you loved me not despite my sharp edges, but because of them." Victoria had squeezed his hand tighter. "I promise to keep choosing you, every day, through every challenge, through every moment of doubt or fear. I promise to be your partner, your equal, your home. I promise to love Sophie and Ethan with everything I have. And I promise to keep reminding you that you're enough, more than enough, exactly as you are." Daniel had been crying openly by the time she'd finished, not bothering to hide it. His own vows had felt inadequate in comparison, but he'd taken a steadying breath and begun. "Victoria, 5 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd used up my chance at happiness, at love, at building something meaningful. I'd resigned myself to just surviving, getting through each day, protecting Sophie, not hoping for anything more." He'd paused, looking at her. "Then you walked into that school fundraiser in your designer dress and your CEO confidence, and I thought there was no way someone like you would ever look twice at someone like me. But you did. You saw past the struggling single dad, past the small apartment and the limited bank account, past all the baggage I carried. You saw me," he'd continued, "the real me. And somehow you decided I was worth the risk." Sophie had wiped her eyes beside him, and Daniel had felt his throat tighten. "I promise to be worthy of that risk, to show up for you the way you've shown up for us, to support your dreams even when they're bigger than mine, to be your safe place when the world demands too much, and to never ever take for granted what a miracle it is that you chose this life with me." He'd looked at Sophie and Ethan. "We're a team now, a family, and I promise to protect that, to nurture it, to fight for it every single day." When he'd finished, Victoria had been crying too, both of them a mess of happy tears and overwhelming emotion. The officiant had smiled, clearly moved himself. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. "Daniel, you may kiss your bride." And he had, soft and sweet and full of promise, while their guests had erupted into applause and Sophie had bounced excitedly, and Ethan had chosen that exact moment to spit up on Daniel's tuxedo. It had been perfect. The reception had been held at an elegant venue overlooking the water, Catherine's compromise between Victoria's desire for simplicity and her mother's need for spectacle. The room had been stunning, candlelight and winter flowers, round tables with crisp white linens, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the ocean beyond. Their first dance had been to an old jazz standard, Victoria in Daniel's arms, both of them still crying, still overwhelmed by the enormity of what they'd just done. "We're married," Victoria had whispered against his shoulder. "We really are. How do you feel?" Like the luckiest man alive. Terrified, incredibly happy, all of it at once. She'd pulled back to look at him. "Me too, exactly that." They'd swayed together, oblivious to the crowd watching, lost in their own world. The evening had unfolded in a blur of toasts and dinner and dancing. Victoria's colleagues had given speeches about her transformation from ruthless CEO to someone more human, more whole. Daniel's friends had embarrassed him with stories from his single dad days. Catherine had cried through her entire speech about watching her daughter find happiness. But the moment that had broken Daniel completely was Sophie's toast. She'd stood at the microphone, small and brave in her junior bridesmaid dress, and looked straight at Victoria. "When my dad first told me about you, I was scared. I thought you were going to take him away from me, or replace me, or make everything different in bad ways." The room had gone quiet. "But you didn't do any of those things. You made our family bigger without making me smaller. You showed up to my school stuff and helped with homework and braided my hair even though you didn't know how at first." Sophie's voice had trembled. "And when Ethan was born, I thought maybe you wouldn't need me anymore. But you told me I was important, that being a big sister was special, that you loved me no matter what." She'd wiped her eyes. "So I just wanted to say thank you for loving my dad, for loving me, for making us a real family. You're the best mom I could have asked for." Victoria had been sobbing, Daniel too, and half the room had joined them. Sophie had run from the microphone straight into Victoria's arms, and the photographer had captured the moment. Victoria holding Sophie, both of them crying, Daniel's hand on both their backs, while Ethan dozed in a nearby carrier, oblivious to the emotion. It would become their favorite photo from the entire wedding. Later, after dinner and cake and more dancing, Victoria had found a quiet moment with her mother. "Thank you," she'd said, "for all of this, for coming back into my life, for accepting Daniel and the kids." Catherine had cupped her daughter's face. "I wasted too many years being stubborn and narrow-minded. I'm not wasting any more." She'd glanced at Daniel across the room, dancing with Sophie. "He's good for you, makes you softer without making you weak." "He does. And you're good for him. Give him confidence he doesn't know he has." Victoria had smiled. "We balance each other. That's what the best marriages do." Catherine had pulled her close. "Your father would have loved him, would have loved all of this." They'd stood together watching the celebration, and Victoria had felt a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. The evening had wound down eventually, guests departing with hugs and congratulations, Sophie falling asleep on Daniel's shoulder, Ethan peaceful in Victoria's arms. They'd driven home as husband and wife, as a married couple, as a family officially bound together. "I can't believe we pulled it off," Victoria had said, leaning her head against the car window. "What, the wedding?" "All of it. The wedding, the family, the life. 6 months ago I was alone in a penthouse. Now I'm married with 2 kids and a house and a husband who I love more than I knew was possible." Daniel had reached over to take her hand. "No regrets?" "Not a single one." "You?" "Just that I didn't meet you sooner." She'd squeezed his hand. "We met exactly when we were supposed to." At home, they'd put the kids to bed. Sophie in her room, still in her bridesmaid dress, Ethan in his nursery in the tiny tuxedo he'd worn all evening. Then they'd collapsed on the couch, exhausted and happy, still in their wedding clothes. "So," Daniel had said, pulling Victoria against him, "this is married life." "Apparently. How's it feel so far?" "Exactly the same as yesterday, but also completely different." "That makes no sense." "Welcome to marriage." They'd sat in comfortable silence, the house quiet around them, until Victoria had suddenly sat up. I forgot. I have something for you. Victoria, we said no gifts. It's not a gift. It's a promise. She'd retrieved an envelope from her purse. Open it. Inside had been legal documents, adoption papers for Sophie. Daniel had stared at them, not quite processing. I want to adopt her, Victoria had explained. Officially, legally, I know I'm already her mom in every way that matters, but I want it to be permanent, binding, so there's never any question. Daniel's hands had been shaking as he'd read through the papers. You're serious? Completely. If you're okay with it. If Sophie's okay with it. Victoria. He'd looked up at her, overwhelmed. She would be thrilled. I would be thrilled. But are you sure? This is a big commitment. I've never been more sure of anything. She's my daughter, Daniel. She has been since the moment she asked if I was going to leave like her mother did, and I promised I wouldn't. He'd pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Thank you for loving her, for choosing us. Always. I'll always choose you. They'd told Sophie the next morning, sitting at the breakfast table with Ethan in his high chair making a mess of his breakfast. So, we have something to talk to you about, Daniel had started. Sophie had looked up from her cereal, wary. Am I in trouble? No, sweetheart. The opposite. He'd glanced at Victoria. Victoria wants to ask you something. Victoria had taken Sophie's hand. I want to adopt you officially, which means I would be your legal mom, not just your stepmom. Your birth certificate would have my name on it, and legally, we'd be mother and daughter. Sophie had gone very still. Really? Really. But only if you want that. It's your choice. Would I have to call you Mom? You can call me whatever you're comfortable with. Victoria, Mom, whatever feels right. Sophie had looked between them, processing. And it would be permanent? You couldn't unadopt me? Never. You'd be stuck with me forever. A slow smile had spread across Sophie's face. I want that. I really, really want that. Yeah? Yeah, can I call you Mom now? Victoria had started crying again, happy tears that had become almost constant lately. You can call me whatever you want. Sophie had launched herself at Victoria, hugging her fiercely. Thanks, Mom. The word had hung in the air, beautiful and permanent, and Daniel had felt his own eyes burning. His daughter, their family. The adoption process had taken several months, paperwork and court dates and background checks. But eventually, on a rainy Tuesday in March, they'd stood before a judge who'd made it official. Congratulations, the judge had said, signing the final papers. Sophie Brooks is now legally your daughter. Victoria had held Sophie's hand throughout, both of them beaming. Walking out of the courthouse, adoption certificate in hand, Sophie had looked up at Victoria. So now you really can't get rid of me. Wouldn't want to if I could. Even when I'm annoying? Especially then. Life had settled into a new rhythm after that. Work and school and the chaos of raising two kids. Daniel had expanded his consulting business, taking on more clients, enjoying the flexibility it offered. Victoria had continued to challenge corporate expectations about working mothers, bringing Ethan to the office when needed, leaving meetings for school events, refusing to apologize for having a life outside the boardroom. You're changing things, her assistant had observed one day. Other executives are starting to bring their kids around, talking about family obligations without whispering. Good. It's about time this company entered the 21st century. But not everything had been easy. Ethan had turned out to be a challenging baby, colicky and resistant to sleep training, prone to ear infections that left everyone exhausted. There had been nights when Daniel and Victoria had taken turns walking him, both of them zombie-like with fatigue. I don't remember Sophie being this difficult, Daniel had said one particularly rough night. Maybe you've blocked it out as self-preservation. Very possible. They'd made it through, though, taking turns, supporting each other, occasionally calling in Catherine for backup when they were both at their breaking point. And slowly, Ethan had settled. The colic had eased. He'd started sleeping longer stretches. And suddenly he'd gone from being a screaming bundle of needs to a smiling, curious baby who lit up the room. Look at you, Victoria had cooed one morning when Ethan had given her a gummy grin. You're actually happy now. He's happy because he broke us first, Daniel had joked. Classic power move. Sophie had been an incredible help through all of it, entertaining Ethan when he was fussy, helping with bottles and diaper changes, reading to him from her favorite books, even though he couldn't understand a word. "You're going to be such a good big sister," Victoria had told her. "I already am a good big sister." "You're right. You're the best." As Ethan had approached his first birthday, Daniel had found himself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. A year ago, he'd been terrified of having another child, convinced he'd fail, convinced he wasn't enough. Now, watching Ethan take his first wobbling steps across the living room into Victoria's waiting arms, Daniel couldn't imagine life without him. "He's walking!" Sophie had shrieked, dancing around. "Ethan's walking!" Victoria had scooped up their son, laughing as he grabbed at her hair. "You did it, buddy! You're officially mobile!" And Daniel had stood there watching his family celebrate this small milestone and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly knocked him over. This life, these people, this chaotic, imperfect, beautiful reality, it was everything he'd been too afraid to hope for. That evening, after the kids were asleep, Daniel had found Victoria in their bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. "What are you thinking?" he'd asked. "That I don't recognize myself anymore. In the best way." "How so?" 2 years ago, I would have been working right now, reviewing contracts, prepping for meetings, living for the next acquisition." She'd turned to face him. "Now I'm here, thinking about Ethan's first steps and Sophie's piano recital next week, and wondering if we should start trying for another baby." Daniel had nearly choked. "Another baby? Too soon? Ethan's barely walking. We're just starting to sleep again." "I know, but I love being pregnant with him once I got past the terror. And I keep thinking, Sophie's almost 10. Ethan will be 1 next month. The gap is growing. Victoria, we can barely handle 2 kids. We're handling it just fine." Daniel had sat on the bed, processing. "You're serious about this?" "I think so, but only if you want it too. I'm not going to push." He'd thought about it, really thought. About sleepless nights and diapers and the exhaustion of starting over, about how hard it had been with Ethan, but also about Ethan's first smile, his first laugh, the way Victoria had glowed during her pregnancy, the expansion of their family, the deepening of their love. "Ask me in 6 months," he'd finally said, "when Ethan's sleeping through the night and I can think clearly." Victoria had laughed, climbing onto the bed beside him. "That's fair. 6 months. You're really happy, aren't you, with all of this?" Deliriously. "Are you?" Daniel had pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the warmth of her against him. "I spent so many years convinced I'd already had my shot at happiness and blown it, that the rest of my life would just be about getting by, raising Sophie, trying not to want more. And now? Now I wake up every morning amazed that this is my life, that you chose me, that we built this together." She'd kissed him softly. "Best choice I ever made." Marrying me? Saying yes to coffee. Everything else followed from that. They'd lain together in the darkness, talking about the future, about whether they'd have more kids, about Victoria's next career move, about Sophie's education, about 1,000 small decisions that would shape their lives. "Whatever we decide," Daniel had said, "we decide together." Promise? Promise. And he'd meant it, though, because that was what they'd built. A partnership where neither one dominated, where both voices mattered, where love meant making space for each other's dreams. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was the life they'd chosen, and that made all the difference. The following week, Sophie's piano recital had arrived with all the nervous energy of a Broadway opening. She'd been practicing for months, determined to nail her piece, a complicated classical arrangement that challenged even her teacher. Daniel and Victoria had arrived early, securing seats in the front row, Ethan content on Victoria's lap. When Sophie had walked onto the stage, small and brave in her recital dress, Victoria had gripped Daniel's hand. "She's got this," Daniel had whispered. "I know, I'm still nervous." Sophie had sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she'd looked terrified. Then she'd taken a breath and begun to play. The music had filled the auditorium, complex and beautiful, Sophie's small hands moving confidently across the keys. A few measures in, her fear had visibly melted away, replaced by pure focus. She hadn't missed a single note. When the final chord had faded, the audience had erupted into applause. Sophie had stood and bowed, her face flushed with pride and relief. "That's our girl," Victoria had said, tears streaming down her face. After the recital, they'd taken Sophie out for ice cream, a tradition they'd started, celebrating achievements big and small. "You were incredible," Daniel had told her. "Seriously amazing. I messed up one part. Nobody noticed. I noticed." "That's what makes you an artist," Victoria had said. "You hold yourself to a higher standard. But Sophie, what we saw tonight was perfection." Sophie had smiled, spooning ice cream. "Thanks, Mom." The casual use of the word, Mom, still made Victoria's heart skip. Later that night, tucking Sophie into bed, Victoria had sat on the edge of her mattress. "I'm proud of you, not just for tonight, but for everything. For how brave you are, how kind, how much you've grown." "I'm just me." "Exactly, and just you is pretty spectacular." Sophie had hugged her tight. "I'm glad you married Dad. I'm glad you're my mom." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Walking back to her in Daniel's bedroom, Victoria had felt that now familiar swell of gratitude. This family, this life. She'd fought so hard to build an empire, to prove herself in a world that doubted her. But the empire paled in comparison to this, to Sophie's piano recitals, and Ethan's first steps, and Daniel's steady presence. This was the real victory, and it was sweeter than any acquisition could ever be. 6 months later, on a humid summer evening, Victoria sat in her doctor's office staring at another positive pregnancy test. This time, though, the fear was absent. In its place was a quiet joy, a sense of rightness that made her smile even as Dr. Morrison confirmed what she already knew. "Congratulations," the doctor said warmly. "Looks like you're about 8 weeks along. How are you feeling?" "Good. Really good, actually." "And Daniel?" "Doesn't know yet. I wanted to be sure first." Doctor. Morrison had smiled knowingly. "Well, you're definitely pregnant. When are you planning to tell him?" Victoria had thought about it on the drive home, about how different this felt from the first time. Then she'd been terrified, convinced the pregnancy would destroy everything she and Daniel had built. Now she was simply excited to expand their family, to give Sophie and Ethan another sibling, to watch Daniel become a father again, with none of the fear that had shadowed Ethan's arrival. She'd decided to tell him that evening, after the kids were asleep. Daniel had been in the backyard when she'd found him, pushing Ethan on the swing set they'd installed last month. Sophie was doing homework at the patio table, her textbook spread out in the fading sunlight. "Hey," Victoria had called. "Can I steal you for a minute?" Daniel had lifted Ethan out of the swing, settling him on the grass with some toys. "What's up? You okay?" "I'm perfect, but we need to talk." His expression had shifted to concern. "That sounds ominous." "It's not. I promise." She'd taken his hand, leading him to the far corner of the yard where Sophie couldn't hear. "I have news." "Good news or bad news?" "Depends on your perspective." She'd paused, savoring the moment. "I'm pregnant." Daniel had gone completely still, his eyes wide. "You're what?" "Pregnant. About 8 weeks." "But we were going to wait. You said 6 months before we even discussed—" Apparently the universe had other plans. He'd stared at her, processing, and Victoria had felt a flutter of nervousness. They'd talked about maybe having another child, but talking and doing were different things. "Daniel? Say something." A slow smile had spread across his face, genuine and unguarded and full of wonder. "We're having another baby." "We are." He'd pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I can't believe it. Another baby, our third child. Are you happy?" "Happy? Victoria, He'd pulled back to look at her. "I'm thrilled, terrified, but thrilled. How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" "Not yet, but it's early." "We should tell the kids. Sophie's going to be so excited. And Ethan," he'd laughed. "Ethan has no idea what's coming." They'd gathered the family that evening, calling Sophie in from her homework and settling Ethan between them on the couch. "So we have some news," Daniel had started. Sophie had looked up from her phone. "Are we getting a dog?" "No, better." "A cat?" "Sophie, focus. We're having another baby." Her jaw had dropped. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Victoria had confirmed. "You're going to be a big sister again." Sophie had squealed, launching herself at Victoria for a hug. This is amazing. When? Can I help pick names? Can I help decorate the nursery? Is it a boy or a girl? Slow down, Daniel had laughed. We don't know any of that yet. It's still really early. But I can help, right? Absolutely. You're going to be the best big sister to two kids. Ethan, oblivious to the conversation, had toddled over and grabbed Victoria's leg, wanting to be picked up. What about you, buddy? Victoria had asked, lifting him. Ready to be a big brother? Ethan had responded by trying to eat her necklace. I'll take that as a yes. The months that followed had been easier than Victoria's first pregnancy. No morning sickness, no complications, just steady growth and increasing energy as her body adjusted. She'd worked through the second trimester, her expanding belly becoming a fixture in board meetings. By now, her colleagues had accepted that Victoria Hale did things her own way, and that way included being visibly pregnant while negotiating multi-million-dollar deals. You're making the rest of us look bad, one of the other female executives had joked, setting the bar too high. Nonsense, you could do this too if you wanted. Maybe, but I don't have a Daniel at home making it possible. It was true. Daniel had taken on even more of the household management, handling Ethan's care and Sophie's activities while building his consulting business during nap times and evenings. They'd become a well-oiled machine, dividing responsibilities, supporting each other's ambitions, making it work through constant communication and mutual respect. How do you do it? Victoria's assistant had asked one day, watching Victoria pack up to leave at 5 for Sophie's parent-teacher conference. The career, the marriage, the kids, you make it look effortless. It's not effortless, it's deliberate. Victoria had smiled. And it helps to have a partner who actually partners. Daniel and I are equals. We both sacrifice, we both compromise, and we both get to have the lives we want because we support each other. That's rare. It shouldn't be. At home, Sophie had thrown herself into big sister preparations with characteristic enthusiasm. She'd read books about new babies, helped organize the nursery, and started a journal to document the pregnancy. I'm going to give this to the baby when they're older, she'd explained, showing Victoria pages filled with drawings and observations. So they know how excited we were. That's beautiful, sweetheart. Do you think they'll like me, the baby? They're going to adore you, just like Ethan does. It was true. Ethan followed Sophie everywhere, wanting to do whatever his big sister did. When she practiced piano, he'd bang on the keys beside her. When she did homework, he'd scribble on paper with crayons. They were inseparable. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life, Sophie had said one evening while helping Victoria fold tiny baby clothes. 2 years ago, it was just me and Dad. Now I have a mom and a little brother and another sibling coming. It's like we went from being this small, broken family to being whole. Victoria had felt her throat tighten. We were never broken, just incomplete. Same difference. Maybe, but I'm glad we found each other. Me too. As Victoria's due date approached, Daniel's nervousness had returned. Not the paralyzing fear that had marked Ethan's arrival, but a healthy anxiety about logistics and timing. What if it happens during Sophie's piano competition? He'd worried. Or when I'm with a client. What if we don't make it to the hospital in time? Daniel will be fine. Second babies usually take longer to arrive anyway. Usually, but not always. Victoria had taken his hand, placing it on her swollen belly where the baby was kicking. Feel that? Strong and healthy. Everything's going to be okay. You sound very confident. That's because I am. We've done this before. We know what we're doing now. Do we, though? She'd laughed. Okay, maybe not. But we'll figure it out. We always do. The baby, a girl they'd discovered at the 20-week ultrasound, had decided to make her entrance on a crisp October morning 3 days before her due date. Victoria's labor had started gently, just mild contractions that she'd initially mistaken for Braxton Hicks. By the time she'd realized they were the real thing, they were already 5 minutes apart. Daniel, she'd called calmly from the bedroom, we need to go. He'd appeared in the doorway, already reaching for his keys. Now? Now. They'd dropped Sophie and Ethan at Catherine's house. Sophie giving Victoria a fierce hug, Ethan confused about the early morning disruption, and driven to the hospital. This time, Daniel had been calm and present, coaching her breathing, holding her hand, completely focused on supporting her rather than drowning in his own fear. You're doing amazing, he'd murmured during a particularly intense contraction. Liar. I look terrible. You look like you're bringing our daughter into the world. That's beautiful. Victoria had laughed through the pain. Smooth talker. The labor had progressed quickly, much faster than with Ethan. Within 4 hours, Dr. Morrison had been announcing it was time to push. Ready? The doctor had asked. Ready, Victoria had confirmed, gripping Daniel's hand. 3 pushes later, their daughter had arrived, smaller than Ethan had been, but just as loud, announcing her presence with furious cries. She's here, Daniel had breathed, tears streaming down his face. Our girl. They'd placed her on Victoria's chest, and she'd stared down at this tiny person, red-faced and squalling and absolutely perfect. Hi, Maya, Victoria had whispered, using the name they'd chosen weeks ago. We've been waiting for you. Maya had quieted at her mother's voice, her unfocused eyes trying to find the source of the sound. Daniel had leaned in, kissing first Victoria's forehead, then Maya's. Thank you, he'd said softly, for this, for all of it. We made her together. I know, but you did the hard part. Victoria had smiled, exhausted and elated. Worth every second. Later, after Maya had been cleaned and measured and declared perfectly healthy, they'd brought in Sophie and Ethan to meet their sister. Sophie had been reverent, sitting carefully on the hospital bed to peer at the baby. She's so tiny. You were even tinier. Really? Really? Want to hold her? Sophie had nodded eagerly, and Daniel had carefully transferred Maya to her arms, supporting both of them. Hi, Maya, Sophie had whispered. I'm your big sister. I'm going to teach you everything, how to ride a bike and play piano and stand up to mean kids at school. You're going to love it here. We're a pretty great family. Ethan, not quite 2, had been more interested in the hospital bed buttons, but he'd patted Maya's head with surprising gentleness when prompted. Baby, he'd announced proudly. That's right, buddy, your baby sister. Victoria had watched her children, all 3 of them, and felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. This family, her family, built from broken pieces and impossible choices and the courage to love despite fear. The weeks after Maya's birth had been chaotic in the way only a newborn could create. Daniel had taken paternity leave from his consulting work, and together they'd navigated the sleepless nights and constant feedings. But this time felt different. They weren't just surviving, they were actually enjoying it. The late-night bonding, the tiny milestones, the way their family had expanded to accommodate this new person. Sophie had been incredibly helpful, entertaining Ethan when he got jealous of the baby, helping with bottles when Maya wouldn't settle, even changing diapers without being asked. You're amazing with her, Victoria had told her daughter one evening. She's my sister. Of course I am. Not every big sibling is this enthusiastic. Sophie had shrugged. I remember what it felt like when you and Dad made me feel included with Ethan. I want Maya to always know she's wanted, that we all chose to love her. Victoria had pulled Sophie into a hug, overwhelmed by this child's emotional intelligence. How did you get so wise? Good parenting, obviously. They'd laughed together, and Victoria had thought about how far they'd all come. 3 months after Maya's birth, on a Saturday morning, the whole family had gathered in the backyard for a celebration. Maya's dedication ceremony. Not a christening exactly, but a gathering of loved ones to welcome her officially into their lives. Catherine had been there, along with Daniel's sister Emma and her family, Victoria's colleagues who'd become friends, and the small circle of people who'd supported them through everything. Daniel had stood at the center, holding Maya, with Victoria beside him and Sophie and Ethan in front. 2 years ago, he'd begun, his voice steady and clear. I stood at an altar and promised Victoria I would show up every day, that I would choose this family, choose this love, choose the beautiful chaos of building a life together. He'd looked down at Maya, then at each of their children. Today, I want to renew that promise, not just to Victoria, but to all of you. Sophie, Ethan, Maya, you are the greatest gifts of my life. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. Because loving you has made me braver than I ever thought possible. Victoria had wiped her eyes, already crying. I spent so many years afraid, Daniel had continued. Afraid of failing, afraid of not being enough, afraid that happiness was something other people got to have. But this family has taught me that love isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and choosing to love anyway. He turned to Victoria. You taught me that. You loved me when I was broken and scared. You loved Sophie before she was yours. You built this family with me, piece by piece, choice by choice. Victoria had stepped forward, taking his free hand. And you taught me that strength isn't about control. It's about vulnerability, about letting people in even when it's terrifying, about building something real instead of something perfect. She'd looked at their children. We're not a traditional family. We're not what anyone expected, but we're exactly what we need to be. Sophie had moved to stand between them, taking both their hands. We're just us, and that's pretty great. The gathered crowd had erupted in applause, and Maya had chosen that moment to let out a loud burp, making everyone laugh. Well said, Maya, Daniel had joked. Well said. They'd spent the afternoon celebrating, eating and talking and watching the children play in the yard. As the sun had started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria had found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, just watching. Her mother had joined her, both of them observing the chaos. You've built something remarkable, Catherine had said quietly. We've built something real. Same thing, in my opinion. Catherine had squeezed her daughter's hand. Your father would be so proud. I know I am. Victoria had leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling the weight of those words. Thank you for coming back, for being part of this. Thank you for letting me. As evening fell and guests began to leave, as Sophie helped clean up, and Ethan demanded to be picked up by every adult in sight, and Maya slept peacefully in her carrier, Victoria had felt a profound sense of gratitude. This messy, imperfect, beautiful life. She'd built an empire in the boardroom, but this family, this love, was her greatest achievement. Later that night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Daniel and Victoria had collapsed on the couch together. We did it, Victoria had said. What, survived the party? Built this, our family, our life, everything we were too scared to hope for. Daniel had pulled her close, and they'd sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their house, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards as someone shifted in their sleep, the gentle breathing of children safe and loved. Do you ever regret it? Victoria had asked, voicing the question that sometimes still haunted her. Taking the risk on me? On us? Daniel had been quiet for a moment, really considering. You know what I regret? What? That I wasted so much time being afraid, that I almost let fear win. He'd turned to look at her. But regret us? Regret this family, this life, this love? Never, not for a single second. Even the hard parts? Especially the hard parts. They're what made us strong. Victoria had kissed him, soft and lingering, pouring everything she felt into that moment. I love you, Daniel Brooks. I love you too, Victoria Hale Brooks. Just Hale, actually. I know, but you're still mine. Always. They'd stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, in the quiet peace of their home. Years would pass, bringing new challenges and joys. Sophie would graduate high school with honors, earn a music scholarship to a prestigious university, but always come home for holidays with stories and laughter. Ethan would discover a love for science, conducting elaborate experiments that sometimes resulted in minor explosions and always resulted in learning. Maya would grow into a fierce, independent child who inherited her mother's determination and her father's kindness in equal measure. There would be arguments and reconciliations, teenage drama and sleepless nights, triumphs and failures, and everything in between. But through it all, they would have this: the foundation they'd built when everything seemed impossible, the choice to love despite fear, the decision to build something real rather than something perfect, the courage to show up day after day and choose each other. On a spring evening many years later, Victoria and Daniel would sit on their porch watching their grown children play with their own kids in the yard. Sophie's daughter would be at the piano, practicing the same piece Sophie had performed at her first recital. Ethan's twin boys would be conducting some experiment involving baking soda and vinegar. Maya, visiting from graduate school, would be holding her nephew and singing softly. "Look what we made," Victoria would say, squeezing Daniel's hand. "Not bad for two people who had no idea what they were doing." We figured it out. We did. Together. And sitting there, watching their family, the family that had seemed impossible, that they'd built from fear and hope and stubborn determination, they would understand what they'd always known in their hearts. Love wasn't about perfect timing or ideal circumstances. It was about choosing to show up, about building something beautiful from broken pieces, about being brave enough to hope when hope seemed foolish. They'd started with 2 pink lines and impossible odds. They'd built a life that exceeded every dream. And they'd do it all again, every choice, every fear, every moment of doubt. Because the moment that once threatened to break them had become the foundation of everything they would ever build. Their love, their family, their forever.